They used to laugh when I walked by. I remember the sound, small, sharp, like pebbles in a shoe. I walked slower, so my shoes wouldn't slap the pavement and give me away. I smiled when they expected me to, kept my head down when they wanted me to, and learned to disappear between classes and between conversations. Invisible wasn't safe, but it was predictable, and predictability felt like armor. My name isn't important. At least, that's what they wanted everyone to think. To them, I was a file they'd archived. The awkward girl who mixed up names, who wore last season's jacket, who answered questions in the wrong tone. They called me things that stuck, because I let them stick. I believed it for a long time. I even started believing there was something wrong with me for thinking I deserved better. Then one ordinary Tuesday, something tiny happened that felt like a match to dry grass. He, the one everyone wanted to be, smirked across the room and flicked his finger in the air like a puppeteer. He made a joke and the room folded. Jokes at my expense had been the soundtrack of my life, but this one landed different. It wasn't just a laugh. It was a dismissal so clean and casual it felt surgical. They didn't see me as a human reaction in that moment. I was a prop for their amusement. I should have walked away. I should have shrugged and kept being invisible. But the match had already found a spark. Something inside me, who had been training for denial for years, decided it wasn't going to be practice anymore. I looked back. I met his eyes. For a second, the room paused on me, like air before a storm. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I walked up to him, very slowly, and asked him a single question in a voice that didn't tremble. Why do you think that's funny? It was a small question. It was a question that could have been answered and moved on. But he answered like he always did, with a grin and a brush-off that was meant to be final. The brush-off turned me into an irritation, and he moved on. The others moved on. The world kept spinning, but something in me had shifted. That night I lay awake and thought of all the other times I'd stepped aside. I imagined every face that had turned away as a puzzle piece. Each missing piece was a story they'd never read about me. I realized I had stories worth telling, and the only person who could tell them wasn't any of them. It was me. This was the thought that began the plan, not a plan born of anger alone, though anger was a color in it, but one that wanted to show the world what it had missed. I didn't want to ruin people for the joy of it. I didn't want anyone to be broken. I wanted them to be faced with consequences, with truth, with that cold, quiet feeling of being wrong about someone you thought you understood. I told myself it would be clever. I told myself it would be fair. I told myself it would be a mirror. And that is where the line always lives between what hurts and what heals. Intention and result, so I began to prepare. Not in dramatic, obvious ways. There were no midnight meetings with shadowy people. There were small, careful shifts. Saving money in a jar under the mattress. Learning to take a picture that told a story without words. Listening when people assumed I wasn't listening. I watched, and the more I watched, the more I learned the architecture of how they treated me. And why? People who mock build habits. Habits become predictions. If you know the movements, you can begin to change the scene. I wasn't planning to become one of them. I was planning to become a problem they would never expect. And I would begin by making them remember me. But making them remember isn't what they fear most. What they fear is having to admit they were wrong. That is the true nightmare. And for the first time since I could remember, I wanted them to wake up from the comfortable dream they'd built, polite cruelty and all, and see reality clearly. I wanted the mirror to crack. This is how it started. A single question. A refusal to accept the small cruelties as permanent. A decision to become something they would never recognize. Until it was too late, listen closely. The next pieces will tell you how someone who had been invisible took back the narrative, not with violence, but with patience, clarity, and a kind of quiet, inevitable justice. I wasn't born with the badge, mocked. It was a label manufactured in small actions. The sideways jokes, the text threads that left me out, the little nicknames that were never meant to leave their mouths. It was the architecture of exclusion. Tiny bricks stacked over time until I felt walled off. The worst part was how normal it all felt to everyone else. There was a hierarchy in our small world. People like them sat at the top, athletic, loud, effortlessly charming. They didn't have to try to be cruel. Their humor often hid it. People like me learned to navigate the bottom, quiet, careful, easily stepped on. I became an expert at existing without drawing attention. I spent hours cataloging the moments I should have changed. The time a voice recorder captured someone laughing at a story I'd told. The time my homework went missing when a group needed something else to laugh at. The time someone edited a photo and the comments went viral inside our circle. Each bruise was small. Each bruise taught me to be smaller. But small things are also good teachers. I watched who laughed first, who egged them on, and who stayed silent. I noticed how fast people would join a joke once it had momentum, even if they hadn't felt cruel before. It wasn't just me. It was the social machinery that made anyone capable of cruelty. If they were surrounded by the right noises, when you're invisible, you get intimate access to other people's assumptions because they aren't careful around you. They say the unsayable. They make bets. They perform. I began to keep mental notes, names, dates, the exact phrasing of things that stung. Details become material. Material becomes opportunity. You might expect anger to be the fuel. It was one fuel, yes, but not the only one. Another, more practical fuel was time. I had time to observe and to prepare. They had confidence that meant they never practiced humility. They rushed, assumed, and moved fast. I learned to move deliberately. First, I fixed my appearance not to impress them, but to reclaim the mirror. I didn't want to change who I was. I wanted to stop letting their reflection be the only mirror I owned. So I learned to stand straighter, speak clearer, and stop answering every joke with a smile. Those were small acts of defiance. People noticed because they were used to the old pattern. Then I began to gather evidence, not in a malicious way, but in a way that made stories stick to a timeline. Snapshots of messages, screenshots of the text threads, photos from nights that were convenient for the mockers. Nothing illegal, nothing violent, just truth documented. Documentation is a strange kind of armor. When you carry your story in your pocket, the world has a harder time rewriting it. People who had relied on gossip to control narratives suddenly found their gossip to be less useful. Facts are stubborn things. They don't change just because you wish them to. I also started making small friends outside the usual circle. It surprised me how willing people were to listen when you asked honestly. In those conversations, I learned something crucial. Sympathy without action is just another kind of silence. Listening is valuable, but it won't change your life for you. I needed allies who could witness with clarity and hold me accountable. At first, my movement towards standing up wasn't noticed as a threat. It was a curiosity, like a bird changing its wing stroke. People adjusted and joked to test it. They tried their old lines on me to see if I'd revert. I didn't. Every failed test was information. Every small victory was a rehearsal for a bigger stage. I learned to use language as a scalpel. Instead of confronting in public and letting them play the victim, I asked precise questions in private, recorded tone and intent, and kept my cool. The more precise I was, the harder it became for them to gaslight reality. I wasn't looking for revenge then, so much as reclamation. Make the narrative true again, I thought. Let the record reflect what happened. That's when I realized, to become someone they take seriously, I didn't have to become cruel like them. I had to become coherent, organized, and inevitable. Cruelty would only turn me into what I hated, so I chose a quieter path. one with planning, patience, and careful theatrical timing. What follows is the blueprint of that patience. How small acts of courage added up. How the people who had mocked me built a fortress of assumptions, and how I found the key to open every locked door. Every story like this has a pivot, a scene where the stakes change and the comfortable script flips. Ours happened at a winter fundraiser. They had planned it to be a show. Loud music, a photo booth, people in expensive coats laughing under cheap lights. It was the kind of event where jokes become performances, and nobody remembers the details beyond the applause. I went because staying away would have been its own surrender. I wore something simple, practiced walking straight, and kept my phone in my pocket with a list of names. Not to threaten, but to remind myself who had spoken what. I felt like a spy in a place that had been my prison. Halfway through the night, someone decided to prank me. The room loved pranks. They are safe because they happen to someone already labeled as laughable. A girl I thought was neutral. A girl who smiled at everyone and never made waves. Joined in because she didn't think consequences applied to her either. Someone slipped a fake invitation into my coat. An invitation to a secret after party that never existed. People laughed as I opened it. The alpha snorted and the crowd joined. I could have left. The old pattern would have taken the humiliation and hidden it in silence. Instead, I did something they did not expect. I smiled back only briefly, folded the paper, and walked to the center of the room as if I belonged there. The room went quiet because I had interrupted the script with the wrong cue. I spoke into the microphone that someone had abandoned on a table. My voice didn't shake. "I just found this in my coat," I said, holding the paper up like evidence. It's an invitation to a party that doesn't exist. Maybe someone wanted me to be the joke tonight. If that's true, I'd like to say thank you. I've been practicing being invisible, and tonight you reminded me why I don't want to be. There was a ripple. The sound you get when an audience realizes you aren't the character they thought you were. Faces changed. The alpha's smirk tightened. People shuffled because their comfortable roles were being rearranged in front of them. Then, I did two things they didn't expect at all. First, I read aloud, in a calm voice, text messages that contained jokes about me. Messages that people had thought were private. I read tone, context, timing. I didn't scream. I narrated them like a journalist. Fact, date, speaker. The crowd couldn't laugh at facts. Second, I offered a choice. You can laugh now and keep being comfortable, or you can own it. I named names, not to shame in a vindictive way, but to make the record precise. The room filled with the hum of people trying to decide how to react. Here's what I noticed. People who had mocked me for being small were suddenly very aware of how large the room felt. The power shifted, not because I yelled, but because I took up space they hadn't reserved for me. People who had been complicit rubbed their faces like they had misread a line in a play. Others tried the joke again to test whether it still worked. It didn't. After that night, things changed. Not immediately. Change like this is rarely cinematic and instantaneous. But the pattern had been broken. The alpha kept his distance and watched me with something like calculation. Those who had joined the mockery hesitated before speaking about me. The rumor mill lost its lubricant because people who circulated gossip began to worry who would be listening now. That night was the turning point because it showed me power isn't always loud. Power can be meticulous and steady. Power can be the control of one's stories. I used the microphone not to destroy, but to illuminate. That illumination made people squint and shift and rethink. It made them uncomfortable, which is the first step toward accountability. But a turning point also forces a reaction. The comfortable will seek to restore comfort. They will gaslight, deflect, and sometimes strike back in ways that are quieter and more dangerous than a simple insult. The prank was the test. They failed it. After a failure like that, some people quietly plot to reclaim the narrative. And so the real work began. Not the work of a single night, but the long, deliberate work of changing what people believed about me and what they believed about themselves. The pieces were in motion, and the next chapters will show how small, careful strategies sharpened into a plan that they couldn't see coming. People think secrets are currency. I discovered they're also blueprints. Once I started paying attention, secrets revealed the structure of influence in my world. They showed who was reckless when they thought no one watched, and who curated a kinder face when others were near. All of it mattered. I didn't set out to be a detective. I just stopped ignoring things. When someone said a snide thing in a hallway, I learned to note the exact words, the date, and who laughed. When a photo appeared in a private chat, I saved it. People leave traces. Tone in messages, the pattern of who replies fastest, who edits a caption to change a joke after someone is hurt. Those little edits are confessions. I became careful about how I documented things. I never faked anything. I never manipulated photographs or recordings to invent a story. I collected truth as it happened. Sometimes the truth was ugly. People calling me names, making plans, whispering lies that spread like small fires. But truth is a strong thing. It can't easily be sloughed off when you keep showing it to people with steady hands. Not everyone who hurt me was cruel, through and through. Some of them were afraid and followed the louder people for safety. I learned to distinguish the core tormentors from the followers. That distinction mattered later, because justice and revenge are not the same thing. I wanted the difference to be clear. With the secrets came patterns. Someone who laughed at my expense in person would never defend me online. Someone who was generous in public withheld kindness in private. These patterns allowed me to shape a strategy that wasn't about revenge in the sensational sense, but about revealing how behavior looked when it wasn't dressed up. I wanted to dismantle the facade, piece by piece. I also discovered vulnerabilities that weren't humiliations, but leverage. Internships won through connections. College applications padded by favors. A scholarship that came with a hidden expectation of loyalty. Those things showed how dependent some people were on impressions. The very impressions they had constructed by using others as props. There were safer ways to use this information. I started by strengthening my own network. Friends who could corroborate facts, teachers who noticed the shifts, alumni who had seen similar patterns. Building a coalition meant I wasn't the lone voice anymore. I was part of a chorus that could sing facts in harmony. Then came the decisions on timing. You can expose everything at once and look vindictive, or you can time things so that the natural consequences unfold logically. I chose the latter. People are more likely to accept an uncomfortable truth when it is presented calmly and supported by evidence. Drama loves a headline, but justice prefers a record. So I began to release things in ways that made the gossip look petty and the evidence solid. A screenshot here, a testimonial there, a copy of a message thread where they used a joke as a rehearsal for cruelty. Each piece was a stitch in a fabric that revealed a picture. How they had treated me and how they kept the machine running. There were risks. Some people tried to discredit me, to say I was making things up. But the more precise my documentation, the harder it was to deny. When people start gaslighting facts, the witnesses become crucial. Those I'd quietly befriended were now my witnesses. They backed up dates or said, I was there. The power of a witness is underrated. It turns rumor into a legal-sounding record. I never wanted to break people for sport. I wanted accountability. I wanted them to see themselves in the mirror and have to reckon with what they had laughed at. I wanted them to learn the lesson I had to learn. Small cruelties add up, and the person you mock today might be the one reminding you tomorrow that your actions have weight. There's a difference between cruelty that shrinks someone and courage that enlarges them. I decided to use what I knew not to crush, but to compel change. That choice shaped the rest of my plan. Revenge in movies is fireworks. In life, it's more like plumbing, unseen, steady, and effective when it's done right. I didn't want scenes of grand humiliation. I wanted outcomes that made the system correct itself. That meant quiet moves that would create public ripples. My first quiet move was reclaiming reputation in places that mattered. People who control narratives often do it through connections. Employers, clubs, scholarship boards. I started applying for positions I had been told I'd never get, sending clean professional emails, asking for interviews, and showing up polished. The idea was simple. If I was nominated for things I had been excluded from, the optics would make it harder for people to dismiss me. I also began to show up in rooms where history had considered me uninvited. I volunteered for events, spoke in class when I had something to say, and created spaces where my voice could be heard on my terms. Each time I succeeded, the mockers' jokes felt smaller. They couldn't simply laugh if I had a title, or a volunteer badge, or a recommendation from someone respected. Parallel to this, I prepared the public ripples. I drafted a piece for the alumni newsletter about accountability and the culture of kindness without naming anyone. It read like an observation, but when released, people read it sideways and recognized themselves. It was a warm, reflective essay, the kind that makes people evaluate their behavior without feeling attacked. That subtlety was deliberate. You catch more flies with reason than with rage. There were legal and formal steps too. I reported the most serious harassment to the right authorities, not for revenge, but because institutions need to respond, and because documentation at those levels matters. For once, I made the bureaucracy work for me. Emails, meeting notes, witnesses. That formal record layered on top of the social one and made denials harder. Here's where patience mattered. I didn't dramatize. I didn't post everything at once. I released information that made existing rumors collapse under their own inconsistencies. When someone who had joked publicly about me applied for a scholarship, and it turned out their references were inconsistent, the pattern I had been documenting made that inconsistency look deliberate rather than accidental. People began to notice. Not everyone noticed the same thing. Some saw me getting opportunities and assumed I had changed somehow. Others noticed the quiet erosion of influence among those who had mocked me. Influence is sticky. It clings until facts and time wash it away. That wash was slow, but relentless. A friend once warned me that this would breed enemies. That's true. When people's status is threatened, they lash out. But insist on one truth. If your goal is to restore fairness, most people will accept it when it's done with integrity. The ones who refuse are the ones who are complicit. Small acts of justice started having public consequences. A captain of a club who'd publicly mocked me found his nomination questioned because several members who remembered the private jokes spoke up. A popular student's internship offer was put on hold after an employer called references and found inconsistent reports about behavior. These weren't theatrical punishments. They were real-world ripple effects from documented behavior. I didn't celebrate those moments. They felt necessary, not righteous. The objective wasn't to save a harm, but to correct pathways so that new people wouldn't get hurt the same way. I wanted the culture to shift, not to be replaced by a new person wielding the same power differently. Still, there was a cost. I had to maintain clarity under pressure, to weather the attempts to paint me as bitter or jealous. People will always weaponize emotion, but the steadier your record, the harder that weapon becomes. I kept my voice calm, my evidence orderly, and my intentions visible. The ripples grew, and the people who had assumed their power would go unchecked began to ask what had changed. What had changed was simple. I stopped being invisible. And once you're visible, the rules shift. They expected me to explode or to disappear. Neither happened. Instead, I orchestrated a confrontation that looked, from the outside, like a chance meeting turned honest conversation. It was the end-of-year awards night, the same stage where status had been cultivated and displayed. I wasn't there to cause a scene. I was there because I'd earned a place in the program. That alone made the room tilt. They noticed because they had always counted me out like a math problem they'd already solved. After the ceremony, there was a reception. People gathered in small pockets of performance. The alpha and his closest circle were in the center, confident and undefeated. I walked in with 2 witnesses. People who had been with me through the documentation, students, and a teacher who knew the truth. We didn't hide that we were together. Presence matters. I approached the alpha directly. No theatrics, no microphone. Just me, the paper I'd kept folded in my hand, and the calmness I'd practiced for months. He tried the old brush off. I didn't flinch. I asked him plainly about the text messages he'd sent that we all had saved. People nearby bristled. The air contained itself, because a public figure was now accountable in a public place. He tried to rewrite history. He tried charm and denials. But then I did something quieter and more devastating. I handed him a copy of his own words. He read them, and the room went small. It's a strange phenomenon. When someone reads their own voice, back to them in a context that makes it undeniable, they lose their playbook. They have to respond without theatrics. They have to face the person they were, in a version of themselves they hadn't considered. The alpha's friends moved to defend him, which is what coalitions do. I asked them questions about the jokes they'd laughed at, about the ways they'd just been joking while others were hurt. Those questions were surgical because they required simple yes or no answers. People who had practiced evasion found it harder to wriggle when specifics were named. The confrontation ended not in tears or fists, but in a slow, awkward silence as reputations recalibrated. The alpha apologized, the kind of apology that wants to reset the scoreboard rather than accept responsibility. Still, apologies can be useful when they're coupled with action. I accepted it cautiously and asked for something practical, that he work with the school on creating a program about social media etiquette and accountability. I wanted structural change, not performative statements. He agreed. Whether he followed through would be another test. The point of the confrontation wasn't to punish him beyond repair. It was to make him comprehend the ripple effects of tiny cruelties. It was to shift the narrative from, "That's just how he is," to "That was a choice." Some people called me cold for not making the confrontation theatrical. They said I should have made him squirm more publicly. But my aim was different. I wanted sustainable consequences. Public humiliation can be ephemeral and cruel. Structural change is messy but lasting. After that night, things shifted in the social architecture. The alpha's humor grew more cautious. His friends watched their mouths. Others who had once been followers felt less certain who to follow. Not everyone changed, of course. Some doubled down in private. But the space became safer for people who weren't part of the old script. This confrontation taught me that power is not only about confrontation itself, but about what comes after. It's about ensuring that an apology becomes a policy, that a moment of accountability turns into a culture with fewer opportunities for someone to be dehumanized for a laugh. And even as I walked away from that reception, I knew this. Real change takes longer than one night, but that night broke something open. It made the surface of our social pond ripple, and ripples, if repeated, become waves. Justice has a price. So does refusal to forgive without transformation. I had to learn both on the same path. As the weeks passed after the confrontation, some people reached out with sincere remorse. They wanted to learn. They wanted to do the hard work. Those instances were precious and draining in equal measure because helping someone learn takes energy. You have to resist the urge to gloat and instead guide them toward accountability. But there were others who mutated their shame into hostility. They tried to turn the story against me. Rumors swirled that I was seeking attention, that I had manipulated allies, that I was ruining lives for sport. Those claims hit, unlike the small jokes, because they targeted my character, not my actions. It's a classic defense. When you can't win on facts, you attack the narrator. I could have answered every rumor. I could have posted defenses that screamed for absolution. But I'd learned patience. Responding to every slander creates noise that drowns out the record. Instead, I kept our documentation organized and let the right institutions and witnesses speak when necessary. That quiet was sometimes mistaken for retreat, but it was deliberate. There was also loneliness. When you strip away the old dynamics, you lose relationships you had, both healthy and unhealthy. People who had been casual in your life drift away for reasons that are sometimes inconvenient and sometimes necessary. I grieved those absences. Grief is an honest companion in transformation, and I needed to sit with it. Financial and emotional stress followed. I'd put energy into building myself up, but the pattern of being underestimated also meant resources were scarce. I took small jobs, burned fewer candles, and worked late nights to keep my life afloat. The cost of becoming visible included sleeplessness and second-guessing. You pay in comfort when you choose clarity. This is the hard truth. When you challenge a social order, the backlash can be severe, but not challenging it allows the order to persist. That was my calculus, and it required intention every day. I reminded myself of that when doubt crept in like a fog. There were moments when I wondered if I had become too focused on retribution rather than repair. It was a fair worry. That's why I kept asking myself two questions. Am I aiming to break people because I want revenge? Or am I aiming to build a safer system for the next person? If the answer was the latter, then the loneliness and cost took on a purpose. Some of the people who attacked me privately found professional setbacks later because patterns emerged in reference checks and interviews. I didn't celebrate those outcomes. They were consequences of a system finally catching up to truth. I felt sorrow for how people's lives altered because consequences are heavy and they teach harsh lessons. In the quiet mornings, I kept a journal where I wrote what I wanted my future self to remember. That this was not about cruelty, but about accountability. That success wasn't vindictive, but protective. That healing requires both closure and ongoing attention. Those notes were small rituals of care for a person who had been overlooked for years. The cost was high, but there were rewards that mattered in ways louder than any joke could ever be. Respect from people who had once looked away, opportunities that had been impossible before, and the simple peace of sleeping without pretending I was someone who could be stepped on. If I had to name the single hardest lesson, it would be this: you can't force people to change, but you can make conditions where their choices have clear consequences. That's the quiet power of transformation. Not flashy, but lasting. Power has an odd way of teaching empathy once you've wielded it responsibly. When the tables turned, it wasn't about proving I could hurt them. It was about showing how small cruelties accumulate and what happens when the record catches up. Months after the fundraiser, things were different. The alpha, who once steered the room with a laugh, began to speak less and listen more. He asked awkward questions in public forums about the culture he had once embodied. He volunteered for the program he'd promised. Whether he did it for optics or for real, only time would tell. But the change in his tone could not be ignored. Friends who had been bystanders became allies when the optics shifted. That surprised me, and it hurt in its small ways. Some of those allies had never reached out when I was invisible. I forgave them privately, because I knew forgiveness is for the forgiver as much as for the forgiven. It frees you to move forward. I was offered a leadership opportunity in a community group that focused on youth and social media responsibility. They recognized my steadiness and my ability to hold people accountable without spectacle. For someone who had learned to be small, that role felt like a reclamation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about building structures that made mockery less likely. The people who had mocked me faced consequences in the world outside our small circle. Employers and admissions committees care about patterns. Patterns are less sympathetic than isolated stories. The documentation I'd gathered didn't exist to humiliate. It existed to show patterns. Patterns taught the institutions how to respond. This period was not triumphalist. I didn't walk around vindicating myself in headlines. The hardest part was learning how to accept success without letting it morph into arrogance. I had to remind myself, my goal was justice, not domination. There were tender moments too. A few people approached me and confessed things they had said in the past. They seemed smaller, but more human in those confessions. We spoke for hours once about why people follow cruelty, about fear, belonging, and shame. Those conversations sometimes ended in awkward hugs, and sometimes in a slow agreement to try harder. They were imperfect, but real. And then there were those who never changed. Those are the hardest to accept. Some people doubled down on a small social world that prized the same old jokes. You can't fix everyone. That painful acceptance is part of the maturity I had been seeking. At the center of this was a quiet sense of responsibility. When you move from being the mocked to being someone with influence, you carry the risk of becoming cruel in the new role. I tried to avoid that by creating checks around me. Trusted friends who would call me out if I started using my power for petty vengeance. Mentors who reminded me of why I started, and the journal entries that kept me accountable to my original intention. The tables turning meant something else too. I began to attract people who valued depth over performance. They were tired of the old scripts, and they welcomed someone who had been through the other side. Those friendships filled the holes that years of mockery had dug. Ultimately, the turning of the tables taught me that the bravest thing you can do is to use the power you gain to make the next person safer. That's the legacy I wanted. Not to be feared, but to be a gate that someone could pass through into a kinder space. Climaxes in life are rarely lightning bolts. They're often the result of long pressure, an accumulation of small moments finally overwhelming the dam. Our climax arrived quietly and decisively. A popular student, someone who had been the loudest in my mockery, applied for an important scholarship. It was the kind of opportunity that could define a path. I didn't schematize it. I simply made sure the truth was visible to those who would check. I submitted my documents, contacted references who had seen patterns of behavior, and made sure the scholarship committee had a full picture. When the committee met, they had to weigh not only merit, but character. That's how institutions should work. They asked difficult questions. They reviewed reference letters and testimonies. They called people who had been witnesses to behavior I'd described. The patterns I had gathered, the jokes, the private messages, the inconsistencies, all formed a narrative. It didn't feel like vengeance when the committee decided. It felt like a system doing its job. The student didn't receive the award. Instead, he was invited to participate in an ethics program and asked to undergo mentorship and community service related to social responsibility. It wasn't a punishment designed for humiliation. It was a corrective. The ripple from that decision was enormous. Others, who had depended on the old script, found doors that used to open more slowly, or reopened with new expectations. People started asking for accountability, not out of spite, but out of a newly formed standard. Institutions became less willing to excuse behavior behind charm. There were legal and formal consequences too. Some clubs restructured their policies. The school implemented workshops on digital conduct. Policies that had been paper thin, easily ignored, gained teeth. That structural change made me hopeful because it meant fewer people would be vulnerable to the same casual cruelties. This climax wasn't the end. It was the hinge. It proved that when you couple documentation with moral intention, you can bend systems toward justice. The people who had mocked me were forced to reckon with their actions. In contexts that mattered, they had to decide whether to grow or to remain where they were. Of course, not everyone accepted the outcomes gracefully. There was anger from some corners, petitions and rumors attempting to undermine the process. But when outcomes are backed by verifiable facts and balanced institutions, the noise has less power. For me, the climax was less about celebration and more about relief. Relief that the record could not be rewritten. Relief that patterns now mattered more than performance. And relief that the next person walking into my school might find a different environment, not perfect, but safer. I remember standing outside the building the day the decision was announced, watching students pass by with their own dramas and jokes. I felt small in that moment and enormous at the same time. Small, because I am only one person in a larger world. Enormous because my refusal to remain invisible had been a part of changing things. That day taught me another thing. Consequences are most meaningful when they lead to restoration. That scholarship decision led to a structured conversation, to restitution opportunities, to a forced reflection that changed the trajectory for more than one student. That's the kind of result that's worth the hard path. If you asked me now what I would tell the person who used to keep her head down, I would say this: strength is not always loud. Courage can be quiet. The decision to be seen is not always about making others suffer. It's about making the world slightly less likely to suffer the next time. I learned that people who mock do so to feel safe in a group, change their incentives, and many will change their behavior. But change requires someone to keep showing up, to document truth calmly, and to push for structural responses when needed. That's what I did. The moral of my story is not a simple call to vengeance. It's a call to intentionality. If a person hurts you, you have options. You can shrink, you can lash out, or you can build a case for change. I chose the last because it felt like the only way to reconcile the pain with the future I wanted. Here are the things I keep close. First, document what happens. Small things add up. A screenshot saved today might prevent a pattern from continuing tomorrow. Second, build witnesses. Isolation makes the liar's tale easier to tell. Honest witnesses make your story harder to erase. Third, prioritize systems over spectacle. Systems can institutionalize safety. Spectacles give headlines, but rarely sustain change. Fourth, keep your moral compass steady. If you start to enjoy the power you've gained for its own sake, you've lost sight of the reason you started. Use your influence to protect, not to dominate. Fifth, forgive when forgiveness is genuine, but don't forgive to erase accountability. Forgiveness without change leaves the cycle intact. There were days I questioned my choices. I wondered if I had been too hard, if the loneliness was the price of something that could have been simpler. But then someone would tell me they felt safer, or a student would thank me for changing how people speak in hallways, or a teacher would say the climate had shifted. Those moments were my answer. You might be worrying about the ethics of what I did. That's a good sign. It means you care about right and wrong, not just winning. The truth is messy. I made choices that had consequences. I accepted that. I tried to ensure those consequences led to repair, rather than mere retribution. If you find yourself in the shoes I wore, Know that you don't have to become cruel to be right. You don't have to be loud to be heard. Prepare. Document. Find allies. Aim for constructive consequences. And when you get the chance, use your voice to make the place better for others. They thought I would remain their joke. Instead, I became a reminder. People are not props. Our small cruelties have weight. If you're on the receiving end, you can let them define you. Or you can build something that makes them reconsider the next time they think about laughing at someone. This is my final appeal. Choose a path that changes not just outcomes, but culture. That's how a girl everyone mocked becomes not a nightmare, but a force that prevents nightmares for others. Thank you for listening. Remember, being seen is a brave act. Make sure when you stand up, you stand for something that makes the world a little kinder.